So we're here this morning with the Haynes Apperson motor, and I did the video the other day and I mentioned about bluing the bearings, and I've had a few questions about bluing the bearings, so I'll explain that in a minute and give a good example of exactly how that happens. First of all, I just want to discuss the motor a little bit. So we've obviously put this cylinder on and I've got the new rings and the bearings and everything in here. So this is the crankcase, and it's a little different to lots of early veteran stuff, and that doesn't surprise me because everybody had a different idea. This greaser here greases, that's a main bearing, that's an extension of the crankshaft. So that main bearing is the best part of 4 or 5 inches wide. It's bronze, so this greaser greases that, so that the main bearing is not oiled. Likewise, this greaser on this side does the same thing, and this main bearing, because it carries the flywheel, is even bigger again. So this line here is an oil line, and what that does is it feeds down inside the motor, and we've got 2 cam gears inside the motor that run these 2 cams. So they're the exhaust cams. So as the cam goes around, this gets opened up, opens the valves. So that's how that works. So oiling of the big ends and the mains is interesting. If I take this, and you'll notice that I've already blued that up, that's got a hole there, and that drips directly into the main bearing. Likewise here, you'll notice there's a V. So the piston, which I'll show you later on, has an oil hole in it, and this oiler here feeds the top of the piston. So the oil goes onto the piston below the rings, oils the cylinder, and the remaining oil through a gallery in the piston drips down into there, and that comes out there. And I don't know if you can see it in the video, but there's 2 slashes in there that actually feed the oil out to the bush. So having explained that, hopefully well enough, we're going to talk about bluing the bearing. And it'll take a couple of minutes, so I'm actually going to stop the video. But at the end of the day, you can see I've got bearing blue on there and bearing blue on there. And bearing blue just comes in a simple tube. And it's effectively a grease-style dye, for want of a better term. I don't know what the actual components of it are. But so to blue a bearing, you actually feed it onto the crankshaft, like so. And if I rest that there, and I take this, and you'll note that there's numbers. So I need to make sure they're always paired up the same way. And I put the cap on like that. We may be able to do all this in one take. And I do that. They're high tensile washers, and these are grade 12 UNF bolts, drilled for split pin, or in this case we'll actually wire them, because split pins are fairly difficult to get into there, or more to the point, in hopefully 20 or 30 or 50 years time, get out of there. So we'll actually wire up the castle nuts to make sure that they can't come undone. So if I just nip that there like that, so that's nipped. So I'm going to nip this, and then I'll lean on it a bit, so it's got about 25 pounds of pressure on it. So you can see I'm putting a bit of pressure on there. And then I'll do the other one at the bottom, and then I'll undo them both, and I'll show you what the blue does. Right, so you can see I'm leaning on that now. So if I undo that, and then undo that, take the nuts and washers off. Right. So if we look at that surface, all the way around, you'll see that all of the blue has been squashed. There's hardly a high spot on it. You'll see that the blue doesn't get squashed just there. That's for the oil to actually be able to feed into the bearing. So that's a perfect surface. Now, that didn't happen by accident. I spent a couple of hours actually getting that, bluing it, bolting it, and taking away the high spots there. So that gives me a perfect surface to the crankshaft. And then if we take the rod out, you can see we've got very similar here. We've got a slight high spot just there, and just on that spot there. I'm not going to play with those. We've got a good enough bearing surface there. So the next thing to do is clean all that up, make sure it's scrupulously clean. Likewise, because there's now blue all over the crankshaft journal. Clean the crankshaft journal, clean this. Now we've got to gap it. We've actually got to have 0.03 of an inch gap so the oil can actually run around inside the bearing. So that's the next thing to do. And having ascertained a perfect bearing surface, we now need to make sure we've got the perfect gap. Once we've got gap, we'll put it all together.